Hi, I'm working with the Exiles. I hope you're safe and well. In this video I want to talk about throwing a sword, so giving you some tips to throwing a sword within the context of Fury's works. So Fury doesn't actually show us how to throw a sword, but we do have references to that happening. So what I'd like to very briefly cover is a couple of things to bear in mind around why, how, and ways to keep your sword straight when you're actually throwing it. Anybody that's ever tried to throw a sword will know that it's quite difficult to throw it in a straight line. It's by design not something that's, should be good at being thrown. The first one's really easy. Why would we want to throw a sword? Well, it's pretty self-explanatory really. There are times when there are enough openings in what your opponent's doing to throw that sword and land at something. In my view, me personally, I wouldn't want to give away a perfectly good sword by throwing it at someone, but I can appreciate other instances where you would want to. That being said, lots of people I train with, lots of other instructors that we have, they do like throwing swords and they make it work very well for them. The first time we see a reference to a sword being thrown is in the introduction to the one-handed section, the sword in one, the Spada una mano section in Fury's works, where he's introducing the one-handed sword posture, and he is facing off against three people for illustrative purposes. One is thrusting, one is cutting, and one is about to throw his weapon, and he actually tells us that. The position we see that person in is like this, okay? So they are effectively in a Porta de Ferro type position with the sword up on the hip, point high, okay? And we're told that that person is going to throw that weapon. This is a really good position to throw a weapon from, okay? Because it's square on and it lends itself really well to just throwing out the arm. Like throwing anything, the straighter you can keep your arm before release, the straighter the weapon's going to be. But when you're throwing a weapon, or when you're throwing a sword, what you don't want to do is throw it from a great distance, okay? Because the further it travels, the more the point's going to drift, the more the weapon's going to try and swap ends. Remember, it's back heavy, so it's going to try and swap ends. And also, the longer your opponent's going to have to deal with it. And Fury tells us how to deal with it. It's the same principle. You step offline and you make a cover or a beating action. If you are close, the person's going to have a lot less time to do that kind of action. So what I'm trying to say is if you're going to throw a sword, you're not throwing it 10, 15, 20 feet, okay? You're throwing it 4 feet, 5 feet, 6 feet tops, okay? You're not any further than that, and you might as well just be thrusting. The benefits of a throw, again, you can throw a weapon quite quickly, okay? It's going to have a good velocity when it leaves your hands, especially if you're throwing it correctly with your hips and so on and so forth. So going back to this position, this is a position that lends itself really well to throwing a sword, as I say, because it's quite square on. It's not going to have a lot of power in it, okay, because you don't have a great deal of space. You can't get the hip in enough to accelerate the weapon, and the more hip you throw in, the more risk you have of the sword swapping ends, of leaving your hand and swapping ends. So I'll do this from a couple of different angles, okay? This is a new sword, so I'm only ever going to do this once, but I've wanted to do this for quite a while. But as you'll see, when you throw the weapon, I'm sorry my back's to you, when I throw the weapon, especially if I'm only intending to throw it sort of 4, 5, 6 feet towards my opponent, it's quite easy from this position just to throw it and lead with the point, okay? It's very lazy, it's off the hand, it's hard to introduce any hip, but the sword will travel, and it will travel in a straight line. Okay, so that's one instance, okay? Another position that I've found very useful for throwing a sword is a posture found later on in the half-sworded section called posture Sagittarius, okay? We can do this hand up or hand down, all right? This position lends itself really well to throwing the weapon because I've got two hands on it for that extra stability, but also means that I can get a bit more sort of power into the throw, and I can ensure right up until the last second that I am leading with the point, okay? So I'm here, and you can see, yes, it toppled over, but the point would have hit someone, okay? I'm not intending to actually throw the sword that far. I'm only intending to throw it, this far. in my view, the easiest thing to do is just to keep it in a pretty standard grip, which also means it's really accessible as well. So if you're moving and operating, whatever you're doing as part of that fight, you can just quickly throw the sword and you don't have to rearrange your hands or anything like that. Posta Sagittarius is a really good position to throw the sword from, so it's definitely worth a practice of that if you have an old sword, of which this is not, but if you have an old sword lying around that you can throw around as well. Another good position for throwing a sword is Serpentina alla Soprano, which is another guard that we see in the half swording section as well. Again, because both hands are on it. Yes, this is for half swording and all the rest of it, and there is an argument to ask, why would you throw a sword against an armoured opponent? So I'm definitely not saying this is an armoured option, because you probably wouldn't land on anything and you'd just be giving away a perfectly good sword. But the posture is there as well, and this is a good position to throw the weapon from at that close range sort of distance as well, because you can get a lot of shoulder into this and you can power that throw really well, especially if you lean into it. Look, point forward the whole time. I tried to throw that quite flat because I don't want the point of my weapon going into the ground every time, but that would have hit them in the head perfectly square on. Again, I'm throwing the sword over there because there's soft stuff over there. I wouldn't be throwing that more than 6 feet, okay? So there isn't much more to say. That is throwing a sword. I'll leave people to decide for themselves as to the value of throwing a perfectly good sword, but there's a couple of hints and bits and pieces to go on, I suppose. You don't have to use a sword. If you want to practice with something expendable, you can use a bit of wood if you like, but just remember that the more power you put into it, the more likely it is to swap ends. And the further you throw it, the more likely it is to swap ends, and the further you throw it, the more time your opponent's got to react to it. Think of throwing a sword as something you do still at relatively close, just outside of fighting range, just to emphasize the point again. I might be cutting, moving, covering, whatever. I've come to here and I've just lobbed it, okay? I've just thrown it to try and make up that distance. I suppose the one benefit of throwing a weapon that you don't have elsewhere is the fact that your opponent is used to being safe when they're just outside a distance. So if you've got the throw there as an option, they might leave themselves a little bit more open because they think, yeah, he's too far away to thrust or cut at me, but obviously you've got time to pull the throw on. On that basis, for me, it does go back down to this position here, because from there you're throwing at the middle, and it's probably likely that your opponent is going to be giving you a target on the edge of distance for you to quickly throw that into. So a couple of things there, a bit of a ramble, but it's definitely worth a practice, and it is something that we can anticipate happening, and it is an option that we have as well, because otherwise it wouldn't be referenced in the works. You can definitely expect this to happen to you, and it's obviously quite a viable thing of the period. So that's it for now. Until the next one, cheers.